If you were to go someplace and you don't know how to get there, call them.
My car was out.
Yeah, I'm saying they would not.
I will not be so hopefully that will have to explain out.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I have used combs my whole life. Growing up in Texas.
Kim dit een cycle.
My hair and honey up off my neck. Yeah.
Oel tillicum picara hlaska
But
mithlai.
I think as I get older, my hair's getting really too.
I developed a weight across here.
Yeah, that comes from, I guess it's just saying my hair's really, my hair is really wavy. And that's from my mother. Is she vaccinated? And they have a new child. Yeah, they decided that. The boy. 10 months old already.
Kim dit een cycle. Oel tillicum.
Ah, thank goodness. Sorry, that was more startling than I intended. Okay.
I understand with the child, but I don't, she shouldn't have a problem. We're all we stay this, we're all vaccinated. I think everybody's respectful of one another. Somebody develops a problem. That's right. So have you caught up on any of the articles in the Clackamas Review regarding that?
Yeah. Well, not the one in the I've read this one.
Okay.
I haven't read one in the class.
Because they started tearing down the mill.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
they're going to reinstate the channel, the side channel.
And there are many more plans.
Yeah.
Too. Good morning. Welcome back. How's everybody doing?
Pretty good.
Good.
And yourself?
Not bad. Not
Is your
bad.
wife back?
Thursday. She's back in town. Yeah. Thursday. Which both I and the dog are probably equally excited about. There were pluses and minuses to us both being home over the course of the last year in terms of the dog's upbringing.
Yes.
The minus is that she's gotten accustomed to having the attention of 2 adults as opposed to just one. So we've reached an agreement, her and I.
What's her name?
Madeline. But when Ellen gets back, it'll be great. Okay, let's recap quickly. First week was an overview. Last week we talked about what things looked like in pre European influence days, right? So snapshot of 1650 or 1550. doesn't make a big difference. One of the things that we're going to do today is I'm going to show you this video that I promised. It's about, I normally don't enjoy showing videos during my things because, I'm not going to get into that. But in this case, I think it'll be very helpful, especially to hear it from somebody besides me. It's a fantastic video as well, too. So the video is about 14 minutes long. It's just a snapshot. Well, it's not a snapshot. Let me back up. It is a video that's been put up by the Grand Ron Educational Trust, or Cultural Trust, that it's kind of it was meant to be a mini documentary, but it basically just kind of describes the perspective of the Grand Ron community regarding life in the Pacific Northwest, regarding where they came from. And it doesn't get into any, I mean, it's only 14 minutes, right? So it doesn't get into anything with any great detail, but I think it's worth the watch. So I'll show you that today. I want to talk about this article in just a moment. And then the other thing that we'll do is we're going to make the transition into talking about what happens as Europeans start to show up. So then for the next, and I don't really have a concept of how long it's going to take us to get through this, but for the next several weeks, that's what we're going to be talking about. Is we're going to be talking about what happens when the peoples of the Pacific Northwest come into contact with Europeans and how that brings us to the establishment of the reservations in 1850. Because it's essentially about 250 years, I mean, hard to think about, but it's essentially 250 years of things that happened between first encounters and establishment of the reservations, right? What, 150? 200, we'll compromise, right? Because the first Europeans wind up around there in the late 17th century. So a lot of things happen in that time period that then creates the circumstances that contribute to the establishment of the reservations. And we talked briefly last week about how it was a very traumatic experience, especially for the members of the Grand Ron Reservation, wherein most of these folks were living in their village, right? And militia folks came in, said, you've got 24 hours to pack up 12 hours to pack up everything that you want to take with you. And we're moving you, and most of them were at a place called Table Rock, and we're moving you from Table Rock to what is now the Grand Ron Reservation. The other piece that's important to understand about this is that when the Grand Ron Reservation was established, it was a vast amount of land. It included a significant portion of the Oregon coastline. Now, obviously, in 2021, that is not true. The Grand Ron Reservation covers a small patch that has no coast, right? It's essentially in the, well, it's just west of the coastal range. But there are things that happen to arrive at that. That story is true of pretty much of every community, of every Native community in the Pacific Northwest, is that the land that they were granted in the original treaty, the original reservation, is massively more than a fraction that they occupy now. But we also talked last week, towards the end, about how, especially for a tribe, or for a group like the Grand Ron Confederated Tribes, most of their folks don't live on the reservation. They have, for better or worse, integrated into the society of the Pacific Northwest, and they live in and around the Portland-Salem area, but still culturally identify as being members of the Grand Ron Confederated Tribes and participate extensively in that. Consequently, that's why we have something like the Grand Ron Cultural Trust, who, now that they are living more dispersed, still take an interest in educating not only the member of their tribes, but also all of us, which I think is a pretty great opportunity. Let's talk really briefly about this, because this is a great segue into what we're going to talk about today. So, as I mentioned, many of these, well, all of the different reservations lost a significant amount of property, and it's a combination of attrition. When these places were established in 1850, I don't know if there was a lot of foresight put into the inevitable expansion of white folk into this area. Just keep in mind that Oregon wasn't a state when the Grand Ron Reservation when any of the reservations in Oregon were established. So at that time, they obviously weren't looking ahead to this being a populated area, and they weren't looking ahead to the consequences of having the tribes occupy land that would be desirable, objectively, by anybody. So what happens is as more and more people move into this area, it's just attrition. And there were a lot of different schemes that were involved in terms of taking land from the reservation. And we'll talk about, I'm getting ahead of myself. So some of it was attrition. We already mentioned last week too about in 1950, what was it, 1953, 1954, the termination of reservations, right? And that essentially wiped the slate clean, because after the reservations were terminated, that land was sold off to a greater extent. So by the time the restoration of the reservations was reestablished in the 1980s, you're trying to buy back land from private interests and et cetera, et cetera. It's really tough. So we're going to cover all of that, whether you want to or not, over the next several weeks. Primarily because I find it fascinating. It is simultaneously an interesting cultural historical piece, and it's also an interesting legal piece, because I think one of the important things of understanding this history is understanding how it impacts us in 2021. We've already talked about how fishing rights affect water rights, for farmers in Southern Oregon. And not to be a doomsayer, but this is going to become even more important in years to come as the effects of global warming are felt more and more in the Pacific Northwest. We're already watching what happens as global temperatures rise. We've got more wildfires, we've got lack of water. All of these things are going to get more important as time goes on. And I think it's especially important to listen to the voices of people whose primary interest is the land itself, right? Because, I find it fascinating that they're advocating, well, if there aren't any fish to fish, then our fishing rights don't exist. But they're not necessarily concerned about being able to fish. They're concerned about there being fish in the water, where there has been water, where there have been fish, for the duration of human existence, and how that is for them a faithful thing to do, both in their cultural, religious understanding, but I would advocate from especially a Christian understanding. So how many of you folks got a chance to read about this, hear about this? Yeah, mostly, I would imagine. Yeah. So Grand Ronde has now officially reclaimed the Willamette Falls down by Oregon City. Beautiful spot, except that it has been marred for decades, long before my existence here in the Pacific Northwest, by the defunct mill that sits there. Which, me coming in as an outsider and seeing Willamette Falls for the first time, I was always really confused. Because I looked at that, I'm like, that is an amazing geographical landscape there. Like the way that the falls, kind of tumble in, and it's this really stark line, the line that falls there. I thought, that is just gorgeous. Why is all that stuff down there? And again, this is in no way, shape, or form me demonizing industrialization. This is one of innumerable examples of the ways that we've, the way that industrialization has captured the forces of water in order to produce products for the global economy, right? That's a different conversation to have. But I was always confused because I didn't know that it was a defunct mill. I thought that potentially that was still in working. And so I would put that, I'm like, what in the world is that there? So when I began to learn a little bit about it, now it suddenly made more sense. So Grand Ronde Reservation is retaking possession of this. I'm not going to show you the article. I'm just going to try and zoom in on some of the pictures, maybe. Is retaking possession of the Willamette Falls, and I think one of the cool things that this is going to involve is that they are leveraging the resources of the tribe to revitalize this area. So on a cursory reading of the article, they're planning obviously to tear down the mill. But then essentially, it seems the spirit of their desire for this space is not only to make it accessible to the broader population, but they also want it to be an educational site as well too, which I thought was super cool. Because there's a quote in the article, they say, we don't want it to be a place where you just stop in to get a coffee. We want it to be a place where you can come in and experience nature, experience the setting, and learn about why it's so important to us as a tribe. So my understanding is that it's simultaneously going to be a nature site, but then also a cultural heritage site for the tribes of the Grand Ronde. They intend to be able to have ceremonies, intend to be able to have meetings themselves there. And I look forward to when that gets completed. Current timetable is recklessly optimistic, but of course that's every timetable for every public work. I think they said they were hoping to have things wrapped up in like 4 or 5 years, which not going to happen. But hey, if not, did I tell you about the story of the Lumi tribe in Northwest Washington, where they managed to put in an aquaculture 100 days ahead of the schedule that people thought they would be able to do it. And they did it all on their own. They didn't have any outside contractors. They rented bulldozers, dump trucks, the whole 9 yards, and the entire tribe pitched in to build a dike, basically. I'll tell you that later. And another class will remind me when we get to talking about that. Absolutely fascinating. So they, the members of the Grand Ronde tribe had a ceremony there. They said some prayers and some blessings. There is the beginning of the deconstruction. Kind of a cool picture there. And then I wanted to show you that. There we go. This is the proposed construction for the Blue Heron site, as they're going to call it. So like you can see, this will be kind of like a outdoor park area here. But I think I thought I saw another map where they were showing where they were going to put like a convention hall and a bunch of stuff like that too. But that's all going to be green place, I think, which is going to be pretty neat. And obviously they can't get rid of the dam. You know, that's part of that's part of the landscape forever now. But this is going to be amazing when they finish. So I wanted to introduce it because it's such a great parallel to what we're talking about. They've lost land, now they're reclaiming it. And this is something that's happening nationally too. This is not the only example of its case. There was the Paiute tribe recently reclaimed some land that was gifted back to them by a private owner not so long ago. And there was another, and it wasn't to the Paiute too, it was, I think the Nez Perce recently got some land back as well too. Yeah, Matt.
You know, when I was working with Western Rivers Conservancy, the last project I worked for them with was a project where we turned over 47,000 acres of
Wow.
timberland to the Yurok tribe down in Northern California.
Yeah.
It was actually the project that got me to retire. I was so tired of dealing with the state of California over the approval of the forest plan for that I thought I'd give up and said, you gotta get some guy in his 30s.
It's got energy and it's naive. It's willing to work, ridiculous hours.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've been, what am I about to say, but maybe the plainness of the paper mills at Fountain River isn't quite as obvious unless you were a kid.
Yeah.
I was when it was operating. It smells a lot better now that it stops.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Yeah.
But it's because they ran the logs down the river
Yep.
and sat right in front of the mill.
Yep.
So that's what it looked like when I was a kid.
Yep. I grew up, Alpena, Michigan had a paper mill, Fletcher Paper Mill. I know exactly what it smells like. Yeah. It was right next to the cement plant that I worked at too, so. Yeah. Paper mills have that wonderful funk to them that pervades the entire geographical area.
And at Camas, that mill has been there for probably as long as, almost as long as
This one, yeah.
And people who are moving in there now are complaining, and I'm going, the mill's been there a long time. You should have checked into this before you bought that $500,000 house and moved in and now complain about the smell.
This takes me back. So when I worked, they're in the news for doing awful things now. Lafarge, a French company, concrete manufacturer. I interned for them for 2 years doing the Department of Environmental Quality water testing and stuff like this. But also our department was responsible for dealing with, we were the ones that got all the neighbor complaints dumped in our lap. Not me specifically, but my boss had to deal with it all the time. And one of the things that was happening, and it's probably not so dissimilar, was that the area around the cement plant was largely undeveloped for good reason. And some canny developers moved in and started building these large homes. And then what we did is people complaining about the noise, complaining about the smell, which wasn't us, it was the paper plant. There wasn't really any smell. Complaining about primarily the blasting that was happening in the gigantic limestone quarry that's impossible to miss if you're shopping for a house, because it literally feels like an earthquake. I mean, so from the community college, which is like 5 miles away, when you blast in the quarry, the walls are gravel. I mean, it's that significant. So imagine living maybe just like a half mile down the road. These people's pictures were falling off the walls every Wednesday. I mean, what do you want us to do? Shut down the business because you get more stuff. Anyways, different perspective. So, anyways, that sounds like you've already read it, but if you're watching the live stream and you haven't read it yet, go for it. Okay. Now, I apologize to anybody that's watching on the live stream or later, but what we will do is I'll send out the link to this video. I know that there is a way for me to do a screen share on the live stream, but I didn't have time to figure it out, so for this week I'm not going to be able to. I could potentially, it wouldn't make a difference. I was going to say I could turn the thing so that the camera could see it, but it wouldn't. Well, you know what? Since this is mobile, I'll just do this. I hope that's not blocking anybody's view. Okay, so like I said, this is the Lifeways document. Let me see what that looks like on this. Oh yeah, that works. Imagine that. Technology. Sorry, I had to look at the thing to see if it was working. Yeah, I don't need to get any more introduction. 16 minutes. Apologies.
Kim dit cycle ul tilicum picara laska mislay.
Yeah.
Welcome to our Lifeways video. Today we're going to share the Lifeways concept and how it relates to our community cultural classes. Our Lifeways program began in 2005. We're 10 years old. It began with the basic idea that we wanted to have tribal community culture classes that focused on the specific tribes that make up the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We wanted to focus on place connecting to our people's traditional homelands. We wanted to focus on culture that was more specific to our tribes and bands. And we wanted to focus on community and family, the key elements that define our tribe. We'll take you through a short journey of the program and activities that we're inviting you to participate in. So come join us. Prior to contact, there were numerous villages here on the island, Southeast Island. Being on one side of the island is the Columbia River, Milwaukie, and then the mouth of the Willamette River, and then also Multnomah Channel comes in here. And it was an important place where the fisheries, such as salmon and steelhead, sturgeon, the smelt runs going up the river, and the lamprey eel. And it was also important for food resources. Important one was the wapato that grew here on the island in the ponds and sloughs. It grew in great quantities here and was used for food as well as trade item. And then when we look at the villages that were here, there were great pieces of artwork that have come from here that were integrated into their daily living. There's the salt stone carvings that we have examples of, We have basketry that came from here, that came from actually acorn cooking pit areas. Antler bone carvings that came from here, and a lot of wood pieces carved were also from here that we have today, that came from our ancestors. Kenema Bluffs is cultural and historic area for the tribes. The Willamette Tumwaters and Clackamas Chinook lived in this area. This is their original traditional homeland area. There's great significance in the sites in this area. It was also, the falls had to be portaged over, and they would bring those canoes here to Kenema Bluffs, and the Willamette Tumwaters would host a variety of other visiting tribes to this area for gatherings, for trade, and for those that are preparing to go to the Willamette Valley, to Kalapuya country. Lake Oswego area, there's old stories about a creature that lived there. There's flatfish who lives in the basalt walls there on the westland side of the river, Winnickites. So there's a lot of the traditional stories that originate from this place. Lifeways is about visiting places that are important to the tribe, historically and culturally. One of these places is Tumwater, or Willamette Falls here in Oregon City. The falls here were for the fisheries, for salmon fishing, steelhead, sturgeon, and the lamprey that could be gathered off the rocks of the falls. There were villages right here at the falls, above the falls and below the falls. The fisheries, salmon fishing, that would begin in the springtime. Then runs would be on the Clackamas later in the year. And then there'd be fall run, winter runs up the Clackamas and Eagle Creek. Eagle Creek drains into the Clackamas and was a winter village area of the Clackamas Chinook and Huachino family. And Oregon City John's village was here at Willamette Falls. And there's a lot of our old stories that tie to this place. Upriver is Rock Island, where Ihuna lived, or the fire tongue. The Wapato was a food resource for our tribes, the Chinookan people that live here along the Columbia River and the lower Willamette. Here we see the nice big green leaves from the Wapato, but it's actually the bulbs that were the food resource. There's a bulb about so big, and then it would be baked in the coals of the fires, and it was just it was also called the Indian potato, pretty much. You could make it like a potato, cook it like a potato. Clackamas people along the Columbia River where it grew in the ponds and lakes and sloughs. It could be traded also as an important trade resource for the tribes in this region because it has a limited area where it grows. And so it could be traded both upriver, down the Willamette Valley, and then into the Puget Sound area. And the Wapato, the way it would be gathered is traditionally women would go out in the ponds and sloughs and lakes, and they would be out in their small canoes, and then they'd get into the water and wade into the water and use their toes, dig in and find the bulb, and then the bulb, they'd loosen it with their toes and then it'd float to the top, and then that's when they would gather it, fit it in the canoe. So that was one of the ways that it was gathered traditionally. Tipsu. It's like a wawa cattail. Pikaba tuling, it's like a wawa tipsu. Here we have tule. This native plant had a variety of uses, such as in basketry and making mats. The mats were used for making partitions in the plank houses, for seating, for making summer houses, and for drying foods such as berries. So we wait a little bit. When we're ready to gather it, we'll just kind of pluck it out from its roots down there. We'll just kind of pluck it out, and then we'll just kind of gather it. Then we'll let it dry, and then it'll be ready to use not long after that. Tule was commonly used by some of the tribes, and then another one that was also used a lot was cattail. Cattail was used in basketry, making cordage, and making mats. The mats had similar uses as a tule, and used for sitting on, drying certain foods such as the berries, and building temporary summer shelters. And then another one is junkus, which was pretty common for our Calpullia tribes. Here we have big leaf maple, Uscan stick, used for making and carving, like for plates and dishes. Here's Indian plum, and Indian plum is like the first sign of spring. You'll see this one blooming with the white flowers. It's the earliest to bloom in the springtime. And it actually has small little plums. And here's some young Pacific 9 bark. And then there's some older with the flowers and stuff. That was used for arrow making. Here's a upala or hazel. And there's a hazelnut there. And this was food. And then also used in basketry. For making hazel baskets, and then also for bows. What they do is they'd kind of set fires and prune around the trees and stuff, or cut them, and they were, for the basketry, would use those that are about 2 to 3 years old. And here we have the oak trees that produce the acorns that were important to all of our tribes. And here we have the white oak tree, conaway stick, and then the conaway, which is the acorns. Grows pretty common in the northern part of the state, up along the Columbia River into the Willamette Valley. And then we have numerous other oaks from the southern Oregon area, such as the tannin oak and the black oak, as well as the white oak. And the acorn was important, and these ones here are pretty young, but in the fall time they'll be ready, and wait till they drop to the ground, and collect them up. They're very bitter if you try to eat them just out of the shell. And so some of our tribes would actually bury them in mud and store them in that way by springs, and that would take out the bitterness, which is tannin that's contained in the acorns. And then it was pounded up and made into kind of like a flour, and some of our tribes mixed it with other things, and some of them made acorn mush out of it. Here we have the service berry. This is one of our earliest berries, and it was really important to all of our tribes, from the Chinookan people along the Columbia River to the Calapuyas, Rogue River, Umpqua, Shastas. And this was a primary berry, and it was gathered and then dried and then stored for the winter time, and then usually a lot of times mixed with other berries and foods.
Well, the Life Place program, my take on it is it's an attempt to recreate a little segment of tribal life, which is people that sit around together and to do their various crafts and tell stories and kind and kind of community building, friendship building, way of life that you see commonplace for travel. And most of the folks around here are spread all over the map. This is an opportunity for travel folks to get together and to enjoy a little bit of travel lifestyle, and at the same time learn new skills, be exposed to language and such a thing.
I'm starting to make these headbands for some of our young girls who are going to be going through the coming of age ceremony. So traditionally these headbands were made with blue jay feathers to cover their eyes so they couldn't see the sky. And we're bringing some of our cedar work into it because we have all of our different tribes represented in this ceremony, and the feathers will go on top of those.
Part of what we're restoring, in these last 30 years, I think is very important to our tribe, especially our language, the arts, the basket weaving and the carvings and the art forms and stuff of the Lower Columbia River. I'm learning so much.
And so for me, it's seeing the whole cycle of things as opposed to thinking like going to the store buying a basket or going to the store buying something, but it's seeing where it comes from and how it grows and where to find them and just the community being together and being able to pass down to my granddaughter.
Finding out about Lifeways was like a big deal for me. To learn that there are people in the tribe that are doing this cultural revitalization and cultural restoration and healing some of those gaps, and repairing some of the damages caused by termination is really important for me.
We've been coming to Greg's classes for a long time, since the kids were really little. Maddie was probably 3 or 4 years old when we first started going in Portland. I remember them going out and crushing the materials to make the paint. We'd be painting on drums. We did some carving. That's when the kids were first introduced to Milwaukie there in Portland with this.
Going out to the canvas prairie and digging up bowls, it creates like a community bond, with these other tribal members that I didn't necessarily know growing up, and other families, and then knowing that through this kind of stuff that my kids will be able to grow up never having not known that stuff and having it just be a part of their life and not something that they have to work hard at to pick up is a powerful thought, and it says a lot to the kind of healing that's going on as a result of these Lifeways classes.
So as you've seen, there's a wide range of activities we do for the Lifeways classes, and we encourage our tribal members and community to come join us. And we hope to see you soon.
What'd you think? Yeah, it's interesting, right? And I'll advertise again. That
This is all on the Grand Ron.
yes.
website?
So if you do the YouTubes, as they say, all of the Grand Run Cultural Education Program is on their YouTube channel, and they've got hundreds and hundreds of videos. So like the ones like these guys, this is a weekly kids cultural class that this couple does, which is absolutely, it's very much tailored for kids. I won't show you it right now, but go check it out. It is worth just browsing through. And then there are also videos I was watching a lot of these because, what better things do I have to do with my time? But there was a great one. I don't know if you'll find it. Oh, this is the one I was talking about, the salmon song. You want to watch that super quick?
Sure.
I'll just show you a little bit of it. It's only 4 minutes 20. This is the, yeah. We'll just watch a couple minutes.
The salmon song, first Brian had caught that song, and so his daughter Kylia had developed the dance for that. And so when we're dancing that song, we envision that we're all part of this big salmon, and we're making our journey around the floor and really trying to respect what that is and the importance of salmon to the tribes from Columbia River. And when the young girls are moving their hands forward, that's the salmon. That's how we're moving our body. That's how we understand how they move through the water. It will start out with a beat, longer spaces between beats. In those times, the girls, again, they're becoming one and all going to the same side. And the first one follows the second. They follow just in line. Then the beat will turn to a triple beat. And when the girls are dancing, their hands are up and down like a wave, and the feet are going to the beat. If it's the longer beat, they'll go from side to side, but their hands are still smooth like the ocean. And even as the beat changes to the triple beat, their hands will still be smooth, their feet will be going doom, 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 doom to the left, doom, 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 doom to the right, but their hands are still smooth like the ocean.
She talks about kind of like why it's important to teach their young kids these things. I mean, so she talks about it's important for us to understand our culture. By understanding our culture, it helps us understand our native our natural world, because she was describing how this dance is all about kind of putting yourself in the mindset of the salmon, right? Being at peace with the water and being unified in your school. But then she talks about how these cultural and natural understandings are also an important part of understanding how you fit into your community. So she was describing how these young girls, when they participate in this dance, they don't put their own costumes on. They have their costumes put on by the elders, by their mothers, or by their older sisters, or whatever, so that they appreciate how much they're reliant upon their elder generation, and vice versa, right? So, I don't know, I get a kick out of it. So as I watched a lot of this stuff, it reminds me of church. I don't know if you all get that same vibe, but the more and more that I have kind of immersed myself in this, the more and more I think that we actually could potentially have a lot in common. Just, I don't know, the general vibe that you get out of it is, I don't know how to describe it, the church vibe.
Well, it's the
It's
connection
community.
with taking care of nature.
Yeah.
We could learn so much from them about how to take care of nature.
Absolutely.
Which is what we're supposed to be doing.
And I think there's opportunities for shared learning as well too. Anyways, this has inspired me in time to come to reach out to the Grand Ronde tribes and see if there's any mutual learning to be done. As far as I'm aware, now granted because of COVID, they've suspended the in-person cultural educational trust meetings, the Lifeways meetings, but they're doing videos instead. But as far as I'm aware, they were open to community members before as well too, and hopefully they reopen them going forward. But like I said, the Grand Ronde Center is literally just down the road from me, so at some point I'm going to pop in there, make a phone call and chat with somebody. Last thing before we take off for today, it was mentioned in the video, but I want to talk about Chinook Wawa. Did you hear him mention that? Okay. So when we looked at, let's look at the language map again. That's why I wrote this up. So when we looked at, that's the wrong page. See if I can talk and. No, I can't find my page. Okay, I won't bring it up. When we looked at the language map before, one of the things that jumped out to me, especially, should probably point a camera back in the direction, was the huge language diversity that's present in a relatively, well, for America, small geographic location. So just looking at the Oregon landscape in general, you've got 15 different languages that are spoken with significant language diversity in there because one of the things that almost all of the books that I've read have enforced is that there were significant and insignificant language. What's the word I'm looking for? Not colloquial. When it's a regional dialects. There were significant dialectal differences amongst the different tribes. They all had kind of their own, it's kind of like what I was talking about sermons. They all kind of had their own way of speaking, even though they were all speaking generally a shared language. Because for these tribes, it was about tribal identity, but then it was also about being able to communicate for trade and for other purposes on a broader basis. But if you look at that map, one of the things that you can figure out is that because of the geographical isolation that the mountain ranges create, those languages tend to be consistent within those areas. So when the reservation system gets put in place, what you get is kind of a tough thing, which is that, for example, for the Warm Springs Reservation, I already mentioned this, you get Columbia River tribes, you get desert tribes, and you get mountain tribes that all get put into the same reservation. So in Warm Springs, they start when in the early days, you actually had potentially as many as 20 languages represented there, but realistically, what eventually happened is that there were 3 kind of languages that rose up that were shared amongst the reservation, and it was Wasco, Sahaptin, and one other. But then, fast forward another 50 years, and you essentially had one language that was spoken amongst the tribes, which was it wasn't one of the 3, it was kind of a mix of the 3. That's what Chinook Wawa is. So Chinook has its base in the original Chinookan language that was spoken by the Multnomah tribes, by the folks along the Columbia River. So if you remember, the Chinook tribes are on the north and south banks of the Columbia and down into the Willamette. They're the waterfront folk. But Grand Ronde Reservation is made up of tribes from the Tualatin area all the way down to Salem. So it wasn't just waterfolk. So you notice the guy in the video kept saying, some of our tribes, right? Over and over again, some of our tribes would do this, some of our tribes would do this. Because the Grand Ronde Reservation represents upwards of 20 individual tribes, right? Not all of them spoke consistent language. Well, over time, what has come out is that the common language that's spoken now, in addition to English, right? Because they're all English speakers as well too. But the language that they're teaching their kids is what is called Chinook Wawa, or you might hear Chinook jargon, which is essentially has a basis in Chinook, but has incorporated the aspects of the languages of the other tribes. The thing I love, because maybe it's my musical ear as well too. I love listening to the stops and the rhythm of the speech as well too. The vowel sound. It's just Maybe next week I'll show you a video where they're speaking more Shinnecoa, so that you can kind of hear some sentences strung out rather than just a few words, but it's super, super cool. Any comments, questions, Jill?
In Pennsylvania, one of their grocery chains, like our Fred Meyer's or whatever, is called Milwaukie.
Is it good?
Yeah, and I made a joke of it to a friend of mine who lives there, because it was relevant to whatever
Yeah.
I thought they were talking about. And she's like, oh, I forget, people don't understand that. That's from the Indians
Yeah.
use the word Wawa, that's where we got it.
No kidding.
So I don't know how they connected, but.
You see, if we have time, that's another thing that I want to look at. Maybe this will be a whole other class eventually. But if you track the and I don't know the technical word for it, like the ethno-linguistic stuff. I did mention it maybe last week. So the Paiute tribes speak an Aztecan derivation. So you can trace that language all the way down to stinking Central America, essentially. That language makes its way fluidly between the Pacific Northwest and Central America. So from an anthropological perspective, this is just got to be mind-blowing to folks now that we're getting an opportunity to look at this stuff. Because I think one of the misconceptions that we've had, well, especially, not we, but white historians previously, was that, all these nice little Native Americans lived in their own little villages in their tribes, and that they were all isolated barbarians, right? Obviously, that's more of a turn of the century perspective. But the more and more that we look at this stuff, we're realizing that there was significant traveling and trade that was happening between the Pacific Northwest and Central America. People moved all over the place, depending on weather, depending on different circumstances, but trade. We're finding stuff from, Texas that ends up in Eastern Oregon, right?
And in Texas, we have what's called Texican.
Texicans?
Texican, because it's a mix of German, Spanish, it's a different language also.
Languages are just absolutely.
I think the same thing with Cajuns. Cajuns, the dialect came from French.
You got 2 minutes?
No.
I actually did a report on this for my French class. So do you know where Cajuns come from? Okay, there's Cajuns and there's Creoles. You understand
Yes.
that? The Cajuns are a combination of French, African American slaves via the Caribbean, via the stop-offs the islands, right, where you get kind of the island vibe, combined with a whole melange, a whole mix of people that had settled in that region. But the thing that marks Cajun is that it's free sale of Louisiana Purchase to U.S. So that culture originates from the peoples that were there prior to U.S. settlement, essentially. And what's significant about it is that it was multicultural, which continues to this day, because you had freed African slaves who were living in this community, and pre the U.S. taking over, the rule that existed was that if you were a freed slave, you were on equal footing with anybody else in that. You could own land, you could anything, right? When the U.S. comes in, obviously that becomes an issue. Okay? But and that's a whole other history. But one of the cultural results of that is Cajun culture. Creole is different. Creole is from folks who were kicked out of Nova Scotia, or Newfoundland, yeah, who were originally French natives, that all came from a specific region, moved over, and then when Britain becomes owners of that island, they kick all these folks out. Same thing, the irony is just astounding, because they saw these French settlers as being equivalent as Native Americans, and they wanted their land. It also didn't help that the French settlers were in good with the Native Americans. They had great relations. So the British folks come in, They want the land these folks are occupying. They brought in a militia from guess where? Massachusetts. They hired a militia from Massachusetts that came all the way up, expelled these people out of there, shipped them to a ton of different locations. And what happens is that all of these folks arrive at these little, it's like South Carolina, New York, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Louisiana. They all received some of these folks. Nobody wanted them. Nobody wanted to do it. So like a third of the people died during this time from starvation and just exposure to the elements. Finally, through a series of events, many of them end up settling in Louisiana. Some of them go back to France. Some of them finally actually go back to Newfoundland and do settle there. But that's where Creole comes from. And it's starts with an A. Acadians, not Akkadian. That's an ancient language that predates Hebrew. Acadians. Yeah. Fascinating. Okay, I kept you on. Thanks, folks. Next week we'll be venturing into what happens when white people show up. Yeah, it's not all awful.